Derek Hargrove didn't shout a warning, didn't ask a question, didn't even look at the judge before he stepped forward and drove his boot straight into Aisha Thompson's chest. A strike so sudden and violent that the entire courtroom fell silent as if someone had cut the sound from the world. Jamal staggered back in shock. Marcus Ruiz froze in his seat, and 40 people watched a woman collapse onto the wooden floor with a soft groan that carried more disbelief than pain, because no one in that room knew that the woman rising slowly, hand pressed to her ribs, blood tracing the corner of her mouth, was the brand new chief of police. They only knew that a veteran officer had just kicked a black woman to the ground in full view of the court, muttering a slur under his breath as he shook out his leg like she was nothing more than an obstacle he needed to remove. And for a breathless moment, it seemed as if the world had narrowed to the sound of her folder hitting the floor and the whispered gasp spreading through the gallery. Aisha steadied herself, lifted her chin, and said with a calm that made the air tighten, "I'm Chief Aisha Thompson. You just assaulted your commanding officer in front of 40 witnesses." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. Someone had already captured every second on a phone held low under a jacket, and that trembling recording would soon detonate across the country. But inside courtroom 5, no one moved. Not even Hargrove, whose face twitched as the truth settled in. Because for the first time in 18 years, he had struck someone who could strike back harder than he ever imagined. Before we go any further into this story, tell me where you're watching from. If you're following stories like this one, make sure you subscribe to the channel and give me a like so these voices reach more people who care about justice and truth. The morning had begun without warning signs, without raised voices or restless murmurs. Only the routine shuffle of a juvenile docket that had played out 100 times before in this same room with its rigid chairs and weary faces. Jamal Thompson, barely 16 and carrying the nervous pride of a boy trying to convince the world he wasn't what they assumed, stood next to a court-appointed attorney who hadn't bothered to learn his name until 5 minutes earlier. The charge was small enough to be forgettable. A missing iPhone from a locker room bench. No fingerprints, no witnesses, only a security guard's assumption and a rushed report. But Hargrove had inserted himself into the case the moment he saw Jamal's name, claiming he was helping the court. Though everyone familiar with Riverton's whispered history understood that when Hargrove took special interest in a case, something was about to break the wrong way. Aisha had entered quietly, dressed not in her new uniform, but in a long black coat that hid the badge she hadn't yet fastened to her chest. She had been sworn in only 2 hours earlier in a private ceremony for which she arrived late, explaining she needed to check on her brother before anything else. She sat behind Jamal, close enough to touch him, but far enough not to draw attention, until Hargrove noticed the gentle way her hand rested on the back of the boy's chair. He walked over with the swagger of a man who believed every space belonged to him, and when Aisha stood to face him, he recognized her only as a black woman who refused to step aside in his courtroom. Her badge was in her pocket, her authority invisible to his eyes, her presence an irritant he felt entitled to remove by force. "You don't get to interrupt court business," he growled, leaning close enough that Jamal took a small step forward, as if he could shield his sister from a storm he couldn't possibly comprehend. Aisha didn't argue. She didn't raise her hands or threaten him. She simply held her ground with a stillness that exposed the cracks in his temper. And that was the moment Hargrove snapped. A single movement, fast and reckless, driven by a prejudice he had never needed to hide. His kick landed high on her chest, sharp enough to knock the breath from her body. Her papers scattered across the floor as she fell, each sheet carrying the quiet weight of someone who refused to abandon the people she loved, no matter how dangerous the room had become. Gasps rose from the gallery like a wave, and the judge's gavel struck once, then twice, but no one heard it. Hargrove stepped back with the grim satisfaction of a man who believed he had restored order. forgetting entirely that the world had changed while he wasn't looking. A young woman in the second row had her phone angled just right, recording through the gap between two shoulders. She didn't breathe as she filmed. She didn't blink until Aisha pushed herself upright and used the edge of the table to stand with slow, controlled strength, refusing to let pain bend her posture. The silence in the room deepened when she finally spoke, her voice steady but edged with something old and unbroken. "Officer Hargrove," she said, "you will step back and place your hands where I can see them." For a heartbeat, he almost laughed, confused by the authority in her tone, until she reached into her coat and revealed the badge the city council had handed her that morning. The gold glinted under the courtroom lights, but the room's reaction came not from the badge itself, but from the realization that the man who had spent almost 2 decades shaping Riverton in his own image had just committed a criminal assault against the one person with the power to tear his kingdom down. Jamal stared at his sister with a mix of fear and awe, trying to reconcile the sister who made him oatmeal on school mornings with the woman now asserting control over a room full of officers who had once followed Hargrove without question. Marcus Ruiz lowered his head, hands trembling, because he had seen this man destroy families with nothing more than a signature. And now the balance had shifted. Even the judge, a man who had relied for years on Hargrove's reports to uphold his conviction record, hesitated before addressing the room. Aisha kept her eyes on the man who had hurt her, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her reach for her ribs. "This ends today," she said quietly, and though the words were soft, they carried a gravity that sank into every corner of the room, as if the walls themselves understood that Riverton had just crossed a threshold from which it could never return. Courtroom 5 had witnessed countless hearings, countless pleas, countless sentences delivered without mercy or nuance, but it had never witnessed a moment like this. One kick revealing 18 years of buried rot, one woman standing with blood on her lip and truth in her voice, and one city about to learn that justice does not always arrive with sirens. Sometimes it walks through a door in a black coat, carrying a folder, and refuses to bow. The video hit the internet like a spark landing on dry grass, and within minutes the 11-second clip of Derek Hargrove kicking Chief Aisha Thompson in courtroom 5 began spreading through Riverton's group chats, then through county Facebook pages, then across national platforms where strangers argued, cursed, and replayed the moment frame by frame, each pause capturing the quiet brutality of a man who believed no one would ever hold him accountable. And by the time the clip reached 500,000 views in 4 hours, the city found itself staring at a mirror it had avoided for nearly 2 decades. Aisha, still carrying the ache in her ribs, posted a single sentence from the official police department account. "We begin today." And that line rolled through the community with a seriousness that made even her critics sit up, because they could hear something in her tone that promised a reckoning far larger than one violent kick. Inside the station, the mood fractured along old, invisible lines. One group of officers gathered in the briefing room whispering that Hargrove would never allow a new chief to ruin his legacy, while another group lingered in doorways as if waiting for permission to admit they had seen this coming for years. And in the middle of that confusion stood Victor Klein, the sergeant who had worshipped Hargrove since he was a rookie and who now found himself assigned to erase the courthouse security footage before the world could demand answers. Yet when Klein reached the evidence terminal and inserted his credentials, he discovered the files were gone, replaced by a simple message that said, "Already delivered." And within an hour, every major news outlet received an encrypted link containing the unedited camera angles showing the kick, the slur, and Hargrove's smug retreat while Aisha stood bleeding but unbowed. Reporters swarmed Riverton before sunset. Helicopters traced slow circles over the station. Talk shows speculated about the fall of a local giant, and Aisha, staying true to the decision she made years earlier, that her work would never be about her emotions, refused every interview request, instead locking herself in her small temporary office with a stack of files tied to Hargrove's past arrests. She didn't complain about the pain in her chest. She didn't talk about the embarrassment of being assaulted in public. What she felt was something colder, something steadier, the weight of responsibility pressing against her shoulders, as if reminding her that she had stepped into a job she could no longer perform cautiously. Every breath hurt, yet she kept reading, pulling one report after another, each name echoing the quiet pattern of a man who had grown too comfortable deciding who deserved freedom and who didn't. Across town. Sarah Hargrove sat at the edge of her bed with the lights off, her hands trembling around the phone she couldn't stop replaying because each viewing stripped away another layer of the man she had married 22 years earlier. She whispered to her son Dylan, "Your father was just doing his job." But even as the words left her mouth, she felt them hollowing out. And Dylan, only 17 yet old enough to understand the difference between duty and cruelty, quietly asked why a man needed to kick a woman half his size to keep order. She had no answer, only the sinking realization that she had defended Derek for so long she could no longer separate her loyalty from her denial. Klein returned home late that night, pacing the kitchen until his wife asked what was wrong. But he didn't speak. Instead, he opened a hidden drawer behind the toaster oven and pulled out a hard drive he had recorded for years just in case. A precaution born from the same fear that now twisted in his stomach. He had spent a decade watching Hargrove operate like a king, rewriting reports, intimidating witnesses, and making small jokes about cleaning up the town one lie at a time. Klein had admired him once, believed he was protecting Riverton. But watching the viral clip again, watching Aisha rise from the floor with dignity that made his chest tighten, forced Klein to confront the truth he had avoided. Hargrove wasn't protecting the city. He was shaping it into something broken. The Riverton mayor issued a statement by early evening, a polished attempt to calm the storm without taking a stance, declaring the incident deeply concerning and promising a swift but fair review. Few believed it. Aisha didn't bother responding. Her silence carried more weight than the mayor's entire speech, and that silence spread through the public like a steady heartbeat, one that suggested she already knew what she planned to do next. In the East District, where the streets changed names every few blocks but the sense of neglect never shifted, teenagers gathered around cracked phone screens watching the clip again and again, some cheering, some afraid, some wondering whether this meant the long shadow of Hargrove's patrols might finally lift. An older woman who had once filed a complaint against him but never heard back wiped her eyes quietly, telling her granddaughter, "Maybe this time someone will listen," and in the juvenile detention intake office. A young clerk named Lena replayed the clip during her lunch break, recognizing the same kick her cousin had described years earlier but could never prove. By nightfall, Riverton smelled of anticipation. Though nobody described it that way, they simply moved differently, talked differently, as if the whole city sensed that the ground under its feet was shifting. Churches prepared statements for Sunday. High school students designed protest posters before their parents told them to go to bed. Local activists, who had been dismissed for years, suddenly found reporters calling them community leaders. Meanwhile, Aisha stood alone in the quiet hallway outside her office, her hand resting against the wall as she breathed slowly through the ache in her ribs. She wasn't thinking about the millions of views or the political fallout or the sudden calls from civil rights groups. She was thinking about the names on the reports scattered across her desk, lives rearranged, families fractured, stories rewritten, and she understood, with a clarity that steadied her, that everything happening online was noise compared to what she needed to uncover inside the department. She returned to her office, switched off her phone, and started marking the cases that didn't add up, thick red lines that cut across nearly 2 decades of policing. Outside. The city moved through the shock of seeing its hero cop revealed. Inside. Aisha worked with a quiet determination that carried none of the chaos swirling online. Her voice on the department account had said, "We begin today." And to her, that sentence wasn't a slogan, it was a mission. In another part of town. Sarah watched her husband's face appear on national news for the first time, not as a decorated officer, but as the man caught on video committing what commentators now labeled an act of unprovoked brutality. She whispered one final lie to herself. There must be more to the story. Yet the deeper truth pressed harder. She had been living with a stranger who hid his darkness behind the badge she once admired. By midnight, Riverton had transformed from a sleepy industrial city into the center of a national debate. Yet inside her small office, Aisha did not look at the trending hashtags or the headlines. She simply leaned forward, opened another file tied to Hargrove's past, and whispered to herself, almost like a promise. This is where the real work begins. Aisha Thompson carried her father's last breath with her into adulthood, and in the quiet hours of the investigation that followed the viral kick, those memories resurfaced with a clarity so sharp it felt like fresh grief. She could still see herself at 15 standing barefoot on hot summer asphalt while her father lay motionless beside the open door of their old sedan, the flashing lights reflecting off his brown skin as an officer barked orders at her to stay back, even though she was only a child trembling through the shock, watching the life drain from a man who had been pulled over for a broken taillight. And that helplessness, those brutal, slow seconds, had shaped everything she later became, pushing her toward the badge not out of admiration, but out of refusal to let anyone else's family be swallowed by the same silence. Years later, that memory pressed against her ribs as she sat in her office tracing her fingers over the stack of old complaints, each one bearing Derek Hargrove's signature, each one denied, dismissed, or conveniently lost, yet across town. In a dimly lit garage where Hargrove kept his old patrol files. A different kind of memory suffocated him. The night in 2006 when he sprinted through smoke-filled hallways and carried a black child out of a burning apartment. The boy's arms wrapped around his neck, soot streaking both of their faces. And for a brief moment he felt like the man he used to be. But his mind never lingered on that part. It always froze 2 months later, in the alley behind a liquor store, where he held his partner's head in his lap after the gunshot, whispering, "Stay with me," while the blood seeped through his fingers and the sirens approached too slowly. And that grief, unprocessed and unspoken, had hardened into something poisonous that hollowed him from the inside without anyone noticing. In the present day, Aisha looked over the 22 buried complaints, letting them form a pattern, the same language repeated in different handwriting, the same witnesses retracting their statements after clarification, the same prosecutors closing cases that never should have reached court. Ethan Caldwell's signature appeared on most of them, each page showing the neat, precise strokes of a man who had built his career by trimming the truth. Aisha exhaled slowly, aware that each document she touched was not just a piece of paper. It was a life that had been reshaped by someone's ambition or cruelty. She took a red pen and circled the oldest complaint. Elena Vasquez, fractured ribs, assault during a disorderly arrest, dismissed due to lack of cooperation. Elena was now 38, working at a clinic 2 towns over. Aisha wrote her name on a list of calls to make. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She let it ring twice, then answered with a steady voice. "This is Chief Thompson." The line was silent for 3 seconds before a distorted voice whispered, "Stop digging while you still can." A click. Then nothing. Aisha looked at the screen, then at the window reflection showing the bruise forming across her collarbone. Whoever made that call believed fear could still shape her choices. They didn't understand that she had stopped fearing men like Hargrove the moment she stood over her father's body and saw how little accountability meant to those who hid behind the badge. Not long after that warning, another message came in, a photo of her daughter, Amaya, sitting on the school playground bench with a juice box in hand. Unaware that someone had taken her picture from a distance, under it, the words, "Choose your battles." Aisha's throat tightened, not from fear, but from fury sharpened by love. She forwarded the message to the cybersecurity unit with instructions to trace the sender. Then she called the school to increase security. She didn't panic. She didn't cry. She simply locked her jaw and whispered to herself, "You crossed a line. Across town." Marcus Ruiz sat at his kitchen table staring at the untouched dinner his father had placed in front of him. His hands shook with the weight of a choice he had avoided for years. "You don't say a word," his father urged, voice rough with old pain. "Hargrove already took 8 years from me. He'll take more if you go against him." Marcus looked into his father's tired eyes and saw the fear that had been carved there by a system designed to silence men like him. But Marcus had watched that video, watched Aisha stand back up with blood on her lip, and something in him had shifted. "Dad," he whispered, "if we keep quiet, he wins again." His father pressed a palm to his forehead, torn between protecting his son and protecting the truth he had buried to survive. Eventually, he said nothing, and silence felt like surrender. While Marcus wrestled with his conscience, Hargrove sat alone in his garage, replaying the viral clip with a mix of disbelief and anger. He didn't see himself as brutal. He saw himself as necessary, a man who carried the weight of a dangerous city in his mind. The system had failed him long before he ever failed the system. His partner's death had hollowed him, and the department had moved on while he carried the guilt alone. Over the years, he convinced himself that he was the last barrier between order and chaos. Each arrest, each intimidation, each coercion, he justified them as protection. Aisha's rise to power threatened that narrative, and for the first time, he felt cornered by the very institution he once commanded. He told himself she had provoked him, that she had challenged him publicly, that she was weakening the department with soft leadership. Yet, deep down, beneath layers of denial, a flicker of shame he didn't want to name pulsed in his chest like an old wound reopening. Back at the station, Aisha reviewed Marcus Ruiz's initial witness statement from a case 12 years earlier involving planted evidence, an arrest that led Marcus's father to prison despite inconsistencies so glaring any honest officer would have flagged them. She wrote a note to herself, "Reopen 2011 Ruiz case." Her pen moved quickly, each stroke filled with purpose. She didn't see herself as a savior or a hero. She saw herself as a woman cleaning a house that had been left to rot for far too long. She stepped out of her office for a moment of quiet, pressing her hand against her ribs again as the ache spread across her chest. The memory of her father's final minutes returned with painful clarity, but instead of weakening her resolve, it steadied her. She whispered softly, "For him," and returned to the files. That night, as the station lights dimmed and the city buzzed with anger and debate, Aisha sat at her desk surrounded by documents, each one a fragment of someone's life torn apart by corruption. She didn't flinch when the phone buzzed again with another anonymous threat. She set it aside and underlined another name, Elena Vasquez, knowing her testimony could shift the balance of everything. At that same hour, Marcus stood on his balcony, phone in hand, replaying the video once more. He inhaled deeply, then finally pressed record, his voice shaking as he began to speak the truth he had held inside for 12 long years. In another part of town, Hargrove stared at an old photograph of himself and his late partner, wondering when the man he used to be had disappeared. By dawn, all 3 lives, Aisha, Marcus, and Hargrove, were moving toward an unavoidable collision, shaped by ghosts they had tried to outrun and truths they could no longer ignore. Victor Klein had spent most of his career believing loyalty was the highest form of honor, but in the days after the courtroom kick, that belief began to crumble as he watched Derek Hargrove unravel in real time. He saw the way Hargrove paced the briefing room with a tight jaw and restless hands, the way his eyes twitched when younger officers whispered, the way he barked orders with a desperation that exposed something far darker than fear. And by the time he was instructed to keep tabs on the new chief, Klein understood that the man he once worshipped was spiraling into a place where violence felt like strategy, not accident. And so on a gray, quiet afternoon, he slipped into the parking lot and crouched beside Aisha's car, his fingers trembling as he planted a tracker beneath the rear bumper, telling himself he was following orders even as his conscience whispered that he was crossing a line he couldn't uncross. That same night, guilt pushed him to unlock a metal box hidden behind his furnace, a box holding a hard drive filled with 10 years of secret recordings, every threat, every doctored report, every off-the-record interrogation Hargrove forced him to witness. Insurance he had sworn never to use unless the world became unsafe enough to demand it. And watching the video of Aisha rising from the courtroom floor with blood at her lip convinced him the time had come. Meanwhile, Aisha, exhausted from reopening decades of buried cases, drove home under the weight of unanswered threats. She didn't see the two motorcycles waiting half a mile behind her, their engines idling in the dark, their riders instructed to send a message but keep it clean, because Hargrove still believed he had control of the shadows he once commanded. As Aisha guided her car onto the interstate, she noticed the first motorcycle creeping into her blind spot. The second stayed 2 car lengths behind, weaving just enough to make its intent unmistakable. She tightened her grip on the wheel, kept her composure, and pressed the button on her radio with a calmness that came from years of surviving situations designed to break lesser souls. "This is Chief Thompson," she said evenly. "2 riders tailing me on I-94, no plates, requesting air and ground support." The dispatcher's startled reply crackled through the speakers. But Aisha didn't wait for backup. She downshifted, accelerated sharply, then swerved across 2 lanes with a precision that forced the first rider to brake hard, giving her just enough space to angle toward the next exit. The riders followed, engines roaring. For a few tense seconds, she could feel their presence like the weight of a storm behind her. But training kept her focused. When she reached the service road, she executed a quick, controlled turn that forced one motorcycle too wide. The rider skidded into a ditch while the other sped past her car, and Aisha made a decisive choice. She accelerated toward the remaining rider, clipped his rear tire just enough to throw him off balance, and watched as he lost control and tumbled onto the asphalt with a scream swallowed by the night. She braked hard, stepped out slowly, and kept her distance, one hand near her sidearm. The man groaned, clutching his leg, when units arrived. The officers lifted his helmet, and Aisha recognized him immediately. An off-the-books informant tied to Hargrove's old narcotics cases, a man who should have been in another state under witness relocation, not stalking the chief on a dark highway. She said nothing, only stared at him with a disappointment that cut deeper than anger. While the ambush unfolded, Victor Klein drove across town with the hard drive sitting on the passenger seat like a confession waiting to be spoken. His hands trembled on the wheel. He wasn't afraid of Hargrove's wrath. He was afraid of admitting how long he had carried the truth without acting. At 2 a.m, he arrived at Aisha's house, parking under a street lamp, the neighborhood silent except for the faint hum of insects. He stepped out, walked to her door, and rang the bell with the resolve of a man finally choosing integrity over loyalty. When Aisha opened the door, still wearing the same clothes from the station, bruises darkening across her chest, Klein swallowed hard and said quietly, "Chief, you need to see what I've been holding." She studied his face, saw the weight in his eyes, and stepped aside to let him in. He placed the hard drive on the table, his voice low and unsteady as he admitted that he had recorded Hargrove for years, not because he wanted to expose him, but because he feared one day he might need proof that he wasn't complicit. Aisha listened without interrupting, her face steady, her breathing slow. She knew that this was the moment the investigation shifted from uncovering corruption to dismantling a structure built to protect it. Elsewhere, in the small home where she had spent the last 2 decades pretending everything was normal. Sarah Hargrove packed a suitcase with the quiet precision of someone who had finally reached the end of her endurance. She folded shirts, tucked away family photos, and left a note on the kitchen counter written with a shaking hand. "You turned us into monsters. I won't let you turn our son into one." She paused before walking out. Glancing at the framed photograph of Derek and his partner taken years before, grief poisoned his heart. She touched the frame once, as if saying goodbye to the man she married, not the man he became. Back at Aisha's dining table, Klein opened the hard drive, clicking through audio recordings that captured Hargrove threatening witnesses, mocking victims, and boasting about how he kept the numbers right to secure federal grants. There were files documenting backdoor deals with informants, files showing edited footage before it reached prosecutors, files that revealed a culture of fear wrapped in the veneer of heroism. Aisha listened with a quiet intensity, her eyes focused, her breath steady. When the final recording ended, Hargrove talking about teaching the new chief her place. Klein lowered his head, unable to meet her gaze. Aisha placed her hand on the table, not in comfort but in acknowledgement. "You did the right thing," she said. "Not soon enough," he replied, "but soon enough to matter." She answered softly. At that same moment, the informant from the ambush was being treated at Riverton Memorial Hospital under guard when asked who ordered the attack. He hesitated only long enough to weigh the cost of silence, then spoke the name that would ignite the city by sunrise. Hargrove. By dawn, Riverton was no longer a city bracing for controversy. It was a city standing at the edge of collapse, the truth spreading faster than fear. And as Aisha watched the first morning light drift across her table, illuminating the hard drive that would serve as the cornerstone of everything to come, she understood that this was no longer about a kick in a courtroom or a viral video. It was about dismantling an empire built on intimidation, lies, and the silence of those too afraid to speak. She looked up at Klein and said quietly, with a resolve that echoed through the room, "This is the beginning of the end." The trial of Derek Hargrove began under a pale morning light that did nothing to soften the tension inside the Riverton courthouse, where every seat was filled and every corridor hummed with the quiet murmur of a city preparing to watch its former king fall. When the cameras clicked on and the live broadcast banner appeared across every major network, Hargrove was led into the courtroom in a tan jumpsuit, wrists cuffed, shoulders hunched in a way the city had never seen. His once commanding presence reduced to a man staring at the floor as if afraid to meet the eyes of the people he had controlled for 18 years. Aisha sat at the front, her posture steady, her face calm, the bruises from the ambush fading but the deeper wounds sharpening her resolve. The prosecution began with a simple statement. This is not the trial of a bad day. This is the trial of a broken system. And with those words, the courtroom fell silent. Every spectator aware that they were witnessing more than one man's downfall. They were witnessing the unraveling of an era shaped by fear, manipulation, and the unchecked authority of a single officer who had learned how to bend Riverton to his will. The first witness to take the stand was Elena Vasquez, who carried herself with a quiet strength as she lifted her shirt just enough to show the faint scars along her rib cage. then held up the x-rays from 2011 that documented the fractures she'd suffered after Hargrove slammed her against a squad car during what he later described as necessary force. Her voice trembled at first, but steadied as she recounted the night she'd been handcuffed for asking why she was being searched. She told the jury how she tried to file a complaint, but was warned by a prosecutor, Ethan Caldwell, that pursuing it would destroy her chances of ever working in the county again. By the time she stepped down, 3 jurors were wiping their eyes. The next pieces of evidence were the recordings Victor Klein had surrendered, the insurance files he never intended to be used until he heard the truth in Aisha's voice. In one recording, the courtroom heard Hargrove laughing as he bragged about planting a small bag of pills during a 2012 traffic stop to keep the numbers up for grant season. In another, he told Klein he broke that punk's ribs because he wouldn't stop talking. A chilling echo of Elena's testimony, each clip chipped away at the carefully constructed image of Riverton's hero cop. Each clip forced the jury to confront a man who had hidden his cruelty behind medals and commendations. The defense attempted to argue trauma, painting a portrait of a man broken by the death of his partner, a man who lost his way because the system failed him. But it was jammed between undeniable evidence and a community unwilling to excuse 18 years of harm. And when Jamal Thompson stepped forward, not as a victim, but as a young man determined to reclaim his voice, the courtroom shifted. 16 years old, dressed in a simple black shirt, he read a spoken word piece he had written during the days after the kick, his voice carrying the raw clarity of someone who had seen too much too soon. He spoke about fear as a constant companion, about watching his sister lie on a courtroom floor, and about the weight carried by every young black boy who grows up learning the unspoken rules meant to keep them alive. His words weren't part of the prosecution's case. They were allowed only because the judge believed the jury deserved to hear the impact of Hargrove's violence in human form. When Jamal finished, the silence in the room felt sacred. 2 days later, the trial reached its darkest moment. Guards found Hargrove in his cell with a bedsheet tied around his neck. His face blue, his body limp. He had attempted to end his life, but the officers cut him down in time. When he was brought back to the courtroom the next morning, he was still pale, his hands trembling as if the weight of the truth had finally settled on his shoulders. He avoided looking at his wife's empty seat, avoided the cameras, avoided the whispers. He stared at Aisha only once, long enough for her to see a flicker of the broken man beneath the arrogance, long enough for him to murmur a few hoarse words across the aisle. I thought I was keeping the city safe. It was the closest he had ever come to accountability, and yet not nearly enough. In her closing argument, the prosecutor delivered a measured, steady message. Power without oversight becomes violence. Violence without accountability becomes culture. Today you decide whether Riverton continues that culture or ends it. The jury deliberated for 9 hours. The verdict was read at 6:13 p.m. live on national television. Guilty on all counts: assault, evidence tampering, civil rights violations, coercion, perjury, and conspiracy to defraud federal programs. The courtroom did not erupt. It simply exhaled, as if releasing a breath the city had held for nearly 2 decades. When the judge pronounced the sentence, 15 years in state prison without the possibility of early release, Hargrove lowered his head with a quiet shudder, his shoulders folding inward as if the weight of his own deeds had finally become undeniable. He did not look at Aisha again. She did not gloat. She didn't even blink. She simply stood with the stillness of someone who understood that victory was not measured in a man's downfall, but in the hope that the next generation might grow up without fear of badges wielded like weapons. As deputies led Hargrove away, cameras flashed, commentators spoke. and the courthouse steps filled with quiet conversations rather than celebration. It wasn't triumph Riverton felt that evening. It was relief mixed with the uneasy understanding that a trial could punish a man. But only deliberate reform could heal a city. Aisha walked out the back door to avoid the media swarm, her steady breath carrying none of the exhaustion etched into her bones. She didn't go home. She returned to her office, unlocked the drawer holding the letter Hargrove had written after his suicide attempt, and placed it beside the red-marked files that still needed investigation. She didn't open it. She didn't need to. She touched the envelope once, then whispered into the empty room. We keep going, because the trial might have ended. But the real work, restoring trust, restoring truth, restoring the souls of those harmed, had only just begun. Eastwood Correctional was built for routine punishment, not for former officers. Yet on the third morning of Derek Hargrove's sentence, the steel gates clanged shut behind him with a finality that stripped away whatever pride he once carried, reducing him to a man walking with slumped shoulders and unfocused eyes as he entered a wing filled with people whose lives he had twisted, damaged, or destroyed. The guards offered him no special treatment, no nod of recognition, no whispered assurances of protection. Because in the world behind those bars, a former cop wasn't a figure of authority. He was a target waiting to be claimed. On his first night, he sat alone on the thin-bottom bunk, staring at the cinder block wall while the echo of inmates calling his name drifted down the hallway, each voice laced with a mix of rage and amusement. And for the first time in decades, he faced the unnerving truth that he was no longer feared, no longer revered, no longer the man who commanded entire neighborhoods with a tap of his finger. He tried to sleep, but every creak of the floor and clang of metal jolted him awake, each sound carrying the ghost of someone he had once intimidated into silence. And by morning, his nerves were so frayed that even stepping into the communal showers felt like walking unarmed into an ambush. The attack came quickly, without warning, carried out by 3 men whose faces he recognized even before they moved. One had spent 5 years in prison because Hargrove planted evidence near the floorboard of his car. Another had lost custody of his children after Hargrove wrote a report describing him as uncooperative during an arrest that never should have happened. The third had served a sentence built on a confession extracted through threats. They didn't speak as they approached. They didn't shout or taunt. They simply acted. A fist struck the side of Hargrove's head before he could raise his arms. A boot slammed into his ribs. A bar of soap wrapped in a towel cracked across his jaw. He collapsed to the tile floor, gasping as pain spread through his chest like fire, each breath sharp enough to pull tears from his eyes. Inmates nearby stepped back, not out of pity, but because they knew better than to interfere in a reckoning long overdue. By the time guards arrived, dragging the attackers away, Hargrove was left bleeding, coughing, and curled on the ground. A man stripped of every illusion he once used to shield himself from accountability. The infirmary smelled of antiseptic and stale air. A nurse took one look at his swollen jaw and muttered, "Should have thought ahead," before calling for a doctor. X-rays showed 3 broken ribs, a fractured cheekbone, and 2 missing teeth. Hargrove lay on the narrow bed staring at the lights above him, listening to the steady hum of the old ventilation system. And for the first time since the trial, he felt something raw and unfamiliar. A grief not for the world he lost, but for the man he now realized he had become. He had told himself for years that he was protecting Riverton, but lying there bruised and broken, he recognized that he had used his partner's death as an excuse to justify brutality. Leaning on his grief like a shield, he believed no one could question, while he lay in pain at Eastwood. Sarah Hargrove stood in a courthouse filing for divorce, the documents trembling slightly in her grip as she handed them to the clerk. She didn't leave because of the trial or the media pressure. She left because the video had revealed the truth in a way she could no longer hide from. The man she once thought honorable had grown into someone she no longer recognized, and the only way to save herself, and their son, was to step away before the damage hollowed them both. Dylan, 17 and silent with sorrow, signed the paperwork to change his last name 2 weeks later. He told his mother quietly, "I don't want his shadow on me." Sarah didn't argue. She simply held her son's hand and let him walk into a future free of a name that had once stood for pride. Days became weeks, and the routine of prison life forced Hargrove into a silence he could not escape. He stopped eating full meals. He stopped engaging in conversation. He stopped responding to the taunts thrown his way. Instead, he lay awake night after night, replaying moments he had buried under years of rationalization. He saw the faces of people he'd arrested without cause. He saw the eyes of the child he rescued from the burning apartment. A memory once bright, now painful because he knew he had become the kind of man that child would fear. And he saw Aisha rising from the courtroom floor with dignity he could not understand. Something inside him cracked then, not out of self-pity but out of recognition. He had failed the badge. He had failed the city. He had failed himself one morning, after a week of lingering chest pain. Hargrove coughed up a streak of blood. The infirmary doctor examined him, ordered tests, then returned with a quiet heaviness in his voice. Stage 4 lung cancer. Advanced, terminal. There was nothing to treat but the symptoms. Hargrove listened without expression, absorbing the news as if it were simply another consequence he had earned. Later that afternoon, he asked for paper and a pen, and for the first time in his life, he wrote without defensiveness or justification. 8 pages, no excuses, no denials, a confession to every cruelty he had committed, every life he had distorted, every lie he had told to maintain the image of a hero he no longer believed he ever was. The last page held a quiet apology to Aisha, not for the kick, but for the years of harm that preceded it. When he finished, he folded the pages carefully and addressed the envelope to her office. A few days later, deputies delivered the letter to Aisha. She held it for several seconds, weighing the meaning behind the gesture, then placed it in a file drawer with the other evidence. She didn't open it. She refused to let grief, pity, or sentiment cloud the work still ahead. Justice, to her, wasn't about the fall of a man. It was about rebuilding the lives his actions had disrupted. 5 years passed with quiet speed. Hargrove declined steadily, losing weight, losing breath, losing whatever strength remained. He died in his cell during the early hours of a Tuesday morning, his body thin and his face pale. No family came to claim him. The state handled the burial, a simple marker. No visitors, no flowers. Only the muted acknowledgement that the man who once dominated Riverton had left the world without ceremony. Back in the city he once controlled. Life continued, shaped now by new policies, new leadership, and a new understanding of accountability. Aisha arrived at her office that morning at 6, as she always did, placed the unopened envelope from Hargrove in the same drawer, and whispered to herself, "We keep going." Because even in his death she understood that justice was not an ending. It was a call to remain steadfast, even when the darkness behind a badge had finally burned itself out. Riverton awoke in the years after the trial not with celebration, but with a slow, deliberate shift in the way people breathed, spoke, and carried themselves, as though the city had finally stepped out of a long shadow and was learning how to stand upright again. Yet despite the national awards offered, the television appearances requested, and the speeches written in her honor, Aisha Thompson declined every spotlight placed in front of her, choosing instead to rebuild the city from the inside out. beginning with a simple idea formed during one of her quiet early morning walks through the department's old records room. If Riverton was ever going to heal. The voices silenced by the system needed a seat at the table. She called it the Root Review Board, named not for what was visible above the surface, but for what lay hidden beneath. And she made it the first oversight body in the state composed entirely of former victims, teachers, neighborhood leaders, and students, with not a single uniformed officer allowed to sit on it. When journalists asked why she excluded police, she answered calmly, "Oversight must belong to the people we serve, not the people who serve beside us," and that statement echoed far beyond Riverton, prompting other cities to re-examine the long-held belief that reform could only come from within the walls of an institution. The board reviewed old cases, reopened buried complaints, and held monthly hearings where families had the chance to speak without fear, and for the first time in decades, people from the East and South districts walked into City Hall not as defendants or petitioners, but as rightful participants in shaping the future of their community. The city adopted a new flag shortly after. Plain ash gray. No emblem, no motto, no image of power. And though reporters mocked its simplicity, Aisha understood the deeper meaning. Riverton didn't deserve a symbol yet. It needed time to earn one. When a national anchor pressed her for an explanation, she answered with a quiet conviction. Symbols come after truth, not before. And the older residents nodded, remembering the years when the police crest had been used as a shield to justify fear instead of service. Jamal Thompson, once a frightened teenager standing beside a court-appointed lawyer, channeled his pain into an art form that resonated across the country. His debut album. Room 5, named for the courtroom where he watched his sister rise from the floor with blood on her lip and fire in her voice, climbed the charts faster than he ever expected. The album carried no profanity, no shock value, only the rhythmic honesty of a young man who had survived the kind of injustice many never speak about. Tracks like 40 Witnesses, Red Pen, and Ash Flag became anthems for students in neighborhoods that long felt unseen. Teachers played them in classrooms. Churches used them in youth programs. Community centers invited Jamal to speak, but he never stood behind a podium. He preferred sitting in a circle with the kids, telling them, "I'm not special. I just stopped pretending I wasn't hurting." And the teenagers listened because he spoke with the clarity of someone who had lived under a shadow and learned how to walk out of it without bitterness. Meanwhile, the Department of Justice conducted a 2-year review of Riverton, interviewing hundreds of residents, reviewing thousands of documents, and studying the reforms implemented by Aisha and the Root Review Board. When the final report was released, national headlines announced that Riverton had become the leading model for structural police accountability in the United States. A transformation no one would have believed possible the day Hargrove kicked Aisha in courtroom 5. Cities across the Midwest sent delegations to observe board meetings. Policymakers requested guidance. Civil rights groups called Riverton the blueprint, but within the city itself. Progress felt less like applause and more like quiet, steady work. Aisha continued arriving at the station every Monday morning at exactly 6 o'clock, her footsteps echoing softly through the hallways before most officers arrived. She would unlock her office, place her coffee on the desk, and pull open the drawer where she kept the letter Hargrove wrote before his death. 8 pages of confession she had still never read. She didn't avoid it out of anger. She avoided it because she knew it would offer nothing she didn't already understand. Some truths didn't need to be reopened. Some wounds served better as reminders, not conversations, across town. The community began rebuilding its spirit in small but meaningful ways. School art programs revived. Local businesses opened in long-abandoned storefronts. Teachers reported fewer fights. Residents from West Riverton started attending town halls in neighborhoods they once avoided. And the annual Unity March, once sparsely attended, grew so large that the city had to reroute traffic. At the march, Aisha would walk quietly near the back, not waving, not speaking, simply observing the faces of people no longer afraid to stand together. Sarah and Dylan Hargrove built new lives as well, far from Riverton's weight. They never spoke publicly about Derek, never joined interviews, never sought sympathy. Dylan graduated with honors, pursuing social work with a quiet determination shaped by his painful understanding of what unchecked authority could do to a city. Sarah volunteered at a shelter for women rebuilding their lives after trauma, offering the kind of patience she had once needed herself. As the years passed, Riverton's identity shifted from a city defined by scandal to a city defined by accountability. People stopped whispering about the kick and instead talked about the change. And yet Aisha never viewed any of it as a triumph. She saw it as a responsibility, an ongoing promise to guard the trust that had taken years to rebuild. One late autumn afternoon, after a long meeting with the review board, Aisha walked through the quiet corridors of the station, her steps deliberate, her breath steady. She reached her office, opened the drawer, and looked at the envelope containing Hargrove's final words. She touched it gently, then closed the drawer without opening it. Justice, she believed, was never about closure. It was about commitment. Standing by the window, she watched the gray Riverton flag ripple in the wind, a reminder that the city was still a work in progress, still learning, still healing. And as the sun lowered beyond the distant rooftops, Aisha whispered the words she carried with her into every morning, every decision, every battle yet to come. Justice is not a victory lap. It is a promise that never sleeps. And in Riverton, under the quiet sky of a city finally learning how to breathe again, that promise endured. Thank you so much for watching. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe, leave a like, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Your support helps these stories reach more people.